All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to kick things off. Welcome to the Climate Change Committee's June 6th Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Stuart South, and I'll be a moderator for today. This is the first of what we hope to be a series of webinars. Today's session in particular is in commemoration of World Environment Day, which was officially celebrated yesterday, June 5th. At this time, I would like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. Most important one being that today's session will be recorded. Also, please ensure that your questions to the panelists are submitted through the Q&A window and not the general chat. To start things off, we'll be showing you a short video on a unified approach to climate change in CARICOM. Then we will have presentations from our guest speakers, Craig and Michael, who I'll introduce later. After the presentations, we will have a short Q&A session where you'll have an opportunity to engage with the presenters. And without further ado, let's get things started.
We burn with pride on the essential things of life, like our music, as we should be. Even before we turn to our superstars, more new forms of music have originated from our small quadrant of the world than any other. We're proud of our literature, as we should be. 2 Nobel laureates later, and many other international literary awards. We're proud of our athletics, as we should be. After intensive local training, the fastest men and women in the world come from the Caribbean. However, when it comes to the political, the social, and the economic arena, we are generally filled with despair turning to cynicism. Earlier triumphs from emancipation to independence seem to be in another world. We consider ourselves today disunited, aimless, and stuck. Of course, we are all of these things and more, the good and the bad. We are human, and recognizing our shortcomings, not dismissing them, is the path to betterment. I think, though, this picture is how other people see us in several areas, including advocacy around the climate crisis. The Caribbean is more united, of more singular aim, and making more progress than many think. But But these efforts are fragile, and we need your help to broaden and deepen this unity, which is where my remarks are centered on today. We're not very good at explaining the climate crisis to our people. We're often told that the climate crisis is not a bread and butter issue, but climate change, drought, flooding, threatened livelihoods, these are bread and butter issues, but the connections can seem remote and complex. I'm chair of the CARICOM Commission on the Economy and the Special Envoy to Prime Minister Motley on Investment and Finance. I'd like to spend the rest of my few moments with you today to talk a bit about the Barbados strategy on the climate crisis, our external strategy, and the extent to which it's shared amongst our neighbors. The Barbados position is based on 4 pillars. First, we've been redefining ourselves. The familiar moniker of small island development states is important on analytical grounds, but it doesn't really resonate in international politics. We are less than 0.001% of the world's population. The more we use that term, the more we will be fobbed off with small handouts. We need a more powerful coalition with which our interests are aligned. And so in the climate space, we have introduced the term frontline states. Scientifically defined, the front line is between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. That's where temperature levels and sea levels will reach the highest, causing more devastating floods and droughts and more. We're bang in the middle of the front line. We are the icons of the front line, and we're also part now of a coalition that represents 40% of the world's population, and where the other 60% feel they will soon be there. Conversely, no one who is not a small island development state believes they'll become one. So we are reforming the line, shaping a new coalition. And at COP26 in Glasgow last year, the phrase and concept of the front line broke through into popular parlance for the first time. Secondly, having established our climate vulnerability, we are delineating more clearly climate adaptation from climate mitigation. These two terms are often merged in speech and thought by climate activists, but they have very different geography. Adaptation is what the frontline states have to do to adapt their country, people, and livelihoods today for the climate change that's already happened today, not in some distant future. Adaptation is particular to the front line. The backline, the high northern and southern climes, is net benefiting from climate change. The growing season for their crops have increased. English wine production, for instance, has quadrupled in the past 10 years. The backline is where the resources to mitigate climate change resides. It's where the greatest contribution to climate change was made, but it's where the impact of climate change seems most distant. Which is why not enough is being done. We've been pressing with one voice that we need to shift more resources into climate adaptation. And perhaps the biggest victory for the Caribbean was that this was explicitly recognized at COP26 with a target, a new target, of up to 50% of the $100 billion a year committed to climate finance to go towards adaptation. A further victory for the Caribbean has been the IMF's new Resilient and Sustainability Trust, launched just a few weeks ago, where an additional $50 billion of concessional funding is prioritized to climate adaptation. Prime Minister Motley is being seen as the godmother of the trust, having campaigned and championed it as chair of the IMF and World Bank Development Committee. For demonstration purposes, Barbados will be one of the first countries to use this facility before the end of the year. Climate adaptation is not something the private sector has much interest in. There are few income streams for more robust sea defenses, roofs for low-income households, regrowing reefs, especially as climate change is an uninsurable event for those on the front line. It represents an increasing probability of a significant loss, increasingly correlated with other significant losses. We need to incentivize the private sector to support climate mitigation. Barbados, for instance, has some of the most attractive feed-in tariffs for solar energy and has recently announced a tax holiday for electric cars. But for adaptation funding, what we've been saying with one voice across the region is that the eligibility of concessional finance to governments needs to broaden to include the climate vulnerable. We've defined vulnerable countries as those with a high probability of suffering loss and damage of greater than 5% of GDP from a climatic event within the next 2 years. This will naturally include the small island states of the Caribbean, the Pacific, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been saying that if you broaden eligibility, you also need to broaden the amount of concessional funding, perhaps by using existing special drawing rights, the IMF's special reserve currency, to back the multilateral development banks who are lending more on climate adaptation. And the final thing we're doing with one voice is pressing for the international debt architecture to reform. The Caribbean is at the forefront of developing debt for nature swaps and natural disaster clauses in sovereign bonds. Belize just did a debt for nature swap about a year ago, and we're coming up next in the next few months. Little Barbados is the world's largest issuer of sovereign bonds with natural disaster clauses. These are when an independently verified disaster hits, debt service is suspended for 2 years and then added back on with compensating interest at the end of the bond term. This provides immediate liquidity to the scale required when a borrower gets hit by a climate disaster. Still, it provides certainty for the lender who would otherwise worry that default would ensue. It's had no negative impact on our bond prices so far, and indeed, if anything, something of a positive impact. If the whole world were to have them, and so far only Barbados and Grenada have natural disaster clauses, it would have increased liquidity available to developing countries by around $1 trillion during the pandemic. And that's about twice the amount of money they actually spent. So that's our united strategy. Define ourselves as frontline states, redefine ourselves as frontline states, point out that there is a distinction, an important distinction between adaptation and mitigation. And the frontline states need concessional money for adaptation, arguing that climate vulnerability eligibility for concessional money and more concessional money, and making those arguments, and pushing new debt instruments better suited to a more uncertain and disaster-prone world. We need your support to refine, to deepen, and articulate the strategy. We need professionals like yourself to help mainstream these ideas in policies, in practices, and we need your help, and we need you to join us. Thank you.
Okay, that was a message from Professor Persaud. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend today, but I know that his message was very welcome and very well delivered. And it emphasizes the importance of us as being vulnerable small island developing states, having a unified approach to adapting to climate change. So we're gonna begin the live presentation. Our first presenter will be Craig Johnston. Craig Johnston is a principal economist of the Climate Change Analysis Team in the Financial Stability Department of the Bank of Canada. In this role, he conducts analysis and research on the macroeconomic and financial stability implications of climate change. Part of this work includes incorporating climate-related risks into the Bank of Canada's Financial Risk Assessment Framework. In addition, Craig represents the Bank of Canada on various domestic and international engagements in this area, including the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system. Before joining the Bank of Canada, Craig held an academic position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was previously a lecturer in economics at the University of Victoria. Craig holds a PhD in economics from the University of Victoria. His presentation today will be centered on using scenario analysis to assess climate change transition risk. Welcome, Craig, and the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you, Stuart, and thank you to the Caribbean Actuarial Association for having me. I'll just put up my slides. You should see them appear momentarily. Please stop me if you don't see them.
They're there.
Okay, thank you. So what I want to do is just kick things off with talking about some work that we've been doing at the Bank of Canada, in particular looking at using climate scenario analysis in partnership with our financial system regulator to investigate and build relationships and build support about how to actually use this tool to assess risks. So about a year and a half ago, the Bank of Canada and our financial regulator, OSFI, embarked on a climate transition scenario analysis pilot with a few Canadian financial institutions. And the goals were, as I mentioned, really to build up the participants, but also our own climate scenario analysis capacity. It was also aimed at better understanding the financial institutions' potential exposures to climate-related transition risks and opportunities. And as well, we were looking to better understand financial institutions' own governments and risk management practices as it relates to climate change. What we did is developed our own set of global transition scenarios that really aim to capture the range of risk outcomes that could be stressful to the Canadian economy, and financial system. So the climate transition scenarios were never really meant to be forecast or comprehensive. Rather, they explore different plausible but adverse transition pathways for Canada and the rest of the world, consistent with achieving different climate targets. So the scenarios themselves varied in terms of the ambition and timing of climate policy, the pace of technological change, and they're consistent with global commitments of limiting global warming to below 2°C degrees Celsius by the end of the century, while relying fairly conservatively on some advanced technologies like negative emissions technologies, for example. So I won't go into too much more detail here, but what I want to do is show you some of the key outputs from this exercise. So what we see is, and this is what the analysis illustrated, is there's important sectoral restructuring that the Canadian economy and global economies may need to undertake to meet our climate targets. So the analysis showed that every sector contributes to the transition. And as you can see here, this is global emissions by sector, and effectively they're reducing in every sector. And what it also showed is that the financial impacts may also vary across sectors. And the impacts depend on how the sectors are affected by the emissions and capital expenditure costs, and how the demand for these products is affected by decarbonizing our economies. Now, the scenarios also shed light on the risks of significant macroeconomic impacts, in particular for commodity exporting countries like Canada. So the economic impacts for Canada are driven mostly by decline in global prices for commodities. Particularly, we can think in the Canadian context, fossil fuel energy prices like oil. And this is really brought about by changes in global climate policy, not just domestic climate policy. Now, another key message that we can take away from the macro side is that the analysis showed that delaying climate policy action increases the overall economic impacts and risks to financial stability. Now, what I want to also mention here is it's important to note that the scenarios developed for the purposes of this exercise rely conservatively on future technology availability and other policy measures that could ease the transition. And they also do not consider the effects of physical risks of climate change. We left that work for future work. So the scenarios do not consider innovation in new products or services or the creation of new industries or sectors. Technological innovation could ease the transition on several sectors and mitigate the sectoral and macroeconomic costs of the transition. Now, that's what I wanted to cover in terms of the development of the scenarios themselves. But turning to the financial risk assessment component, the pilot focused on the analysis of credit and market risk to select elements of financial institutions' balance sheets. So the two banks that participated analyzed credit risk to their wholesale loans portfolios, while the insurers analyzed credit risk to their bonds and corporate loan portfolios, as well as market risk to their equity portfolios. And the analysis focused mostly on the pilot participants' Canadian and United States exposures, although other regions were also considered in the analysis. And the analysis also covered the 10 most emissions-intensive sectors in the economy. The assessment of credit risk used a methodology that combines a top-down and a bottom-up approach, borrower-level assessments by the financial institutions using sector-level financial impacts based on the scenarios capture nuances from the bottom-up, while our top-down portfolio impact assessment extrapolates these borrower-level impacts to the broader portfolio. The bottom-up exercise helped the pilot participants identify data gaps, explore new methodologies, develop a deeper understanding and awareness of the impacts of climate transitions to their portfolios. And the bottom-up approach highlighted some limitations and methodological challenges. And this really raised potential issues of consistency and comparability that we're looking to address in future iterations of this work. From the authorities' perspective, the bottom-up assessment really allowed us to address some existing data gaps. So in particular, it provided estimates of the relationship between climate transition and credit risk using financial institutions' own data and risk assessment expertise. And while the estimated relationship, as you can see here, is generally in the right direction, so decreases in net income are associated with increases in the probability of default, there were inconsistencies across estimates, which again warrant some further attention. In terms of the equity valuation impacts, the pilot project used a top-down approach to assess market risk. So using financial data from the scenarios and also coupled this with a discounted dividend model, we estimated the impacts on equity valuations at the sectoral level for each country and region along the transition path. So for example, the analysis showed decreases in equity valuations in the fossil fuel sectors, while the electricity sector experienced gains. So also the analysis suggests that delayed or sudden climate policy actions could increase and create greater risk to the financial markets. And what you can see here is that the delayed scenario, you're following along a path where you're doing no additional climate policy under the scenario, then all of a sudden there's a switch in the path, and that's priced in immediately into markets. And that can create that immediate dislocation from financial markets, which can be adding the most stress to the financial system. So what I'll end with is a few concluding remarks. The pilot project really just represents, it's an important, but just an initial step in a longer path to understanding and assessing climate-related risks, both to the macro economy and the financial system. And this is really how the Bank of Canada views this work. What we've done and we're continuing to try to do is by publishing the final report, all of the scenario data, there's also accompanying technical reports that support all of this work. We aim to provide the broader financial sector within Canada and internationally with different tools and methodologies to assist in assessing and disclosing transition risks, and in the future, hopefully physical risk too. And this is in line with recommendations from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, and other bodies. So with that said, I'll end here. I'd like to thank again the Caribbean Actuarial Association for having me today, and I look forward to some questions and answers when time comes at the end of our hour. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. This time, I'd just like to draw your attention to the Q&A section of down at the bottom of the Zoom platform. If you have any questions for Craig, please ensure while they're fresh in your memory to insert them in the Q&A section. Right now, we're going to actually move on to Michael's presentation. And Michael is a seasoned actuary with over 16 years of professional experience. He is currently a director on the capital management stress testing and projections team, at Manulife, based in Toronto, and has been conducting climate scenario stress analysis since 2018. Michael is a fellow of both the Canadian Institute of Actuaries and the Society of Actuaries, and is a member of the CIA's Climate Change and Sustainability Committee. His presentation today will give us a practical guide in conducting climate change transition risk assessment. Welcome, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. This presentation is going to be fairly basic compared to some of the other comments you've heard today. It's really geared for those just sort of starting out on their climate scenario analysis journey, and I'll give you some tips or sort of follow what I had done when I first started out a few years ago. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I'd like to just level set and define the different types of climate risks that are out there that you might see in your reading. So physical risk, which is the classic sort of global warming that you would associate when you hear about climate change. There's two types, generally speaking: chronic, which is the longer term shift in climate patterns, higher temperatures, sea level rise, chronic heat waves, that sort of thing. And then there's the acute or event driven physical risk, so increased severity and frequency of extreme weather events such as hurricanes, floods, or fires. Legal risk, also referred to as liability risk or litigation risk, is the risk of legal action from failure to manage physical risk or disclose some of the risks that are out there with respect to climate change. Transition risk, which is the one that we're focused on today, is the financial risk of moving to a low carbon economy. Generally speaking, that it comes about from changes in government policy, so new laws or regulations such as carbon taxes, implementation of carbon taxes, that is, or new technologies, so development of new products or services from emerging technologies that could disrupt the existing industries. And also part of transition risk is how consumers' preferences may change. It could alter the demand for certain products. So those are the key risks when it comes to climate change. And as I mentioned, transition risk will be the focus for the remainder of my comments. Next slide, please. So I will go through the steps that I took to conduct a basic transition risk assessment. Generally speaking, or most of the transition risk scenarios that are discussed and the comments from Craig that you just heard tend to be more sophisticated than the approach that I'm about to talk about. They involve third-party models to incorporate all kinds of economic variables. I'll elaborate on this more when we get there. Next slide, please. So the first step is to get up to speed. And you are here watching or listening to this, so that is good. There's a ton of material out there. It's continually evolving, and it is somewhat abstract or a little bit different than maybe the typical actuarial research that you do. So there's definitely a benefit of repetition, whether it be from the same source or from multiple sources and maybe talking about the same thing. So here's a plug for the Canadian Institute of Actuaries and in particular, the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee. Our site has a lot of great resources. They're nicely laid out, grouped by topic and also by practice area. So you can head there, get up to speed. And we do have this time to act policy statement, which lays out a lot of the key issues and challenges in one sort of accessible and easier to read document. Now, there's tons of other resources. I've listed just a few here. The Global Association of Risk Professionals does a really good job putting out webcasts and having really interesting speakers. So if you haven't had a chance to attend any of their sessions, I recommend it. They are, I enjoy them. And then there's a list of some other resources that I've sort of put out just as a starting point, but there's really tons of stuff and new stuff coming out all the time. I would recommend to get a variety of perspectives, not just actuarial or not just risk, but try to understand the climate science, the financial impacts, public policy, some of the tech, like the clean technology that's coming out. That'll just give you more context and will be able to help you as you try to assess climate risk for your organization. Next slide, please. So now let's say you're ready to define your scenario. Generally speaking, for a transition risk assessment, your narrative will involve government policy changes or technology advancements, and they could be technology advancements that we don't know about yet. Just a blanket technology has improved and has disrupted the current economy. So that typically would be the narrative, and then your time horizon generally is short-term or short to medium term. When it comes to something like that, you want to make sure you're ready, as it could happen anytime. And then when it comes to the assumptions, this step can be quite challenging. My advice would be make it easier on yourself and use an existing publicly available scenario. So there are quite a few out there, but your modeling constraints could be, or maybe should be, a consideration. So lots of the transition risk scenarios that are out there, for example, the Bank of Canada one that we just heard about, or the Network for Greening the Financial System, the Bank of England as well, they have scenarios that have lots of different economic variables out there and very detailed variables as well. So it could be the price of commodities or higher level economic data like GDP or demographic data, and it could be fairly granular at the country level at various time points. Lots of data, lots of information, and depending on what you're doing in your role, you may not have models that can accept that information as useful, as interesting as it may be. It may not provide you with something that you can actually use. So keep that in mind when you're using a publicly available scenario. And on the next slide, we can head there. I would like to draw your attention to a scenario that my team used a couple of years ago. So the Prudential Regulation Authority, which is the regulator in England, part of the Bank of England, they had an exploratory climate stress test that they asked all the companies to do. And the one that we used was the 2019 Life Insurance Test Climate Scenario A. So there were a few different ones, but this scenario A was a transition risk scenario. And you can see the narrative there and the time horizon and the assumptions. So the assumptions were really really lent itself well to my models and how we calculate impacts. They were sector-based, they were market value shocks, and fairly basic from that point of view. So on the next slide, you get a better flavor of those shocks. It is a bottom-up approach, and the shocks you can see in that picture or the table on the right, we're at the sector level, you apply it to the market value, and then you can calculate what that happens to your portfolio. Now, this step actually could be a little more complicated than it seems. Not all securities fit perfectly into one specific sector, but you can get around that by making assumptions or using publicly available classifications, things like that. So that was the scenario we used. The next step on the next slide is to determine a key performance indicator. So you have your scenario, you have your knowledge, and now you actually need to do some calculations. But before you do the calculations, you need to know what you're calculating. So I will run through a little bit about what my team did. I'm based in Canada, so our team is focused on the LICAT ratio, and LICAT, which stands for the Life Insurance Capital Adequacy Test, is a key metric used by our regulators and the street to measure capital adequacy or risk-adjusted financial stability for the entire company. It's the ratio of the capital you have to the capital you hold. Using a capital type metric works well for me, not just because I'm in the capital management department, but also because it is a risk-adjusted metric and not focused solely on earnings. So next slide, please. I will take you through some basic calculations of LICAT to show you how it worked. So for fixed income assets, I'll talk about that first. If you hold a bond of a company that would be negatively impacted by the transition to a low carbon economy, then their market value is shocked based on that table that we saw earlier. But the actual shock to market value is really only a part of the story. The other part is that it would have an impact on their ratings. When a borrower's credit rating declines, two things can happen with respect to the LICAT ratio. The value of the bond goes down, which would decrease the numerator, but also the credit risk goes up, which would increase the denominator. And both of those have adverse impacts to the ratio. Next slide. So by figuring out how those ratings change, that is rather tricky. So I wanted to just highlight that and take a minute to mention that this was a significant challenge of the exercise. So the market value of shocks, which in isolation doesn't have as big of an impact as the change in credit rating. I was not personally responsible for calculating the credit ratings. That's not my area of expertise, but we have a credit risk function at Manulife that helps out with that mapping. So wanted to draw their attention there because that is something to keep in mind. So it could be a modeling constraint, even with this sort of high level shock approach. Next slide. On the next slide, we're talking about non-fixed income assets, such as public equity or real estate, if you have that in your portfolio. It's a little bit more straightforward. When there's a shock to the security, the value goes down, obviously, which would have a negative impact to the numerator. But because the market risk is a function of the value, the market risk would actually go down as well, which would provide a partial beneficial offset in the denominator. So after we considered all the bottom-up impacts for each asset that was in scope, we calculated the total impact to the LICAT ratio. And I can say that, even when applying all these market value shocks, I just wanted to mention that once you've calculated everything, you then need to interpret what it means in order to have a meaningful use of your work. So our interpretation was, even after applying all these shocks ranging from plus 15% to minus 65% for certain subsectors, over our time horizon, the stress test showed that our capital levels remained well above our minimum regulatory capital requirements. And that's sort of the soundbite that went into our public disclosures that were used to assess how the success of this stress test. And then on my last slide is just a wrap up review of the steps that I had just gone through. So get up to speed. Another plug here for the Canadian Institute of Actuaries website, and make sure you're getting multiple perspectives. Define your scenario, make it easy for yourself, use one that's already out there. Then you need key metrics, depends on your jurisdiction and your practice area, but capital is an interesting one because it considers risk. And then when you get to your last step of calculation and interpretation, just remember, if you need borrower ratings for your fixed income portfolio, those could be a challenge. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and thanks for having me here today. I look forward to your questions, and hopefully I can answer them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. So at this time, we're going to actually open up the floor for questions. So we'll begin our question and answer segment. There are a couple, just to draw your attention again, if you'd like to submit a question, please go to the Q&A tab and enter your question there, and it will pop up. So I'm going to get to this first question. It's from Raif Yakub. And I guess this one is for Craig. So he says the income of many sectors actually decreased quite substantially. And in this case, why would those sectors actually support any climate change mitigation and adaptation, given that decrease in their income?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. In terms of the equity impacts, and I was looking closely, Michael, at your chart too, from the Bank of England's scenario, I think it was, and it looked to be roughly in line with what we were showing. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind there. So first, again, we're looking purely at the impacts of transition risk. So when you consider the impacts of physical risk, and then the amount that we can reduce and avoid those impacts, the literature is pretty convinced in the argument that the avoidance of physical risks is better than the additional costs associated with transition risk. So there's definitely a benefit that is outside the scope of our work, but that does exist. So you have to keep that in mind when you look at our impacts. The other thing too is that there's what I showed you was at a aggregated level. There are multiple segments within a lot of these sectors. You can think of electricity generation having winners and losers. So oftentimes we think of the coal sector and electricity generation being phased out, and that's detrimental to that sector. It has equity impacts associated with that. But then there's renewables that experience a lot of growth. So unfortunately, those impacts were hidden a little bit from the charts that I showed, but those segments within a lot of these sectors there's very diverse outcomes there. So hopefully that provides a little bit of answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. And I guess just as a follow-up to that, I'll just ask, was the likelihood of different scenarios occurring assessed or considered in choosing scenarios?
So and that's one thing we really have to keep in mind. These scenarios are, there's no probability associated with these scenarios on purpose, whether it's the Bank of Canada scenarios, the NGFS scenarios, those used by the IPCC. They're agnostic to probability or likelihoods. They really are meant to craft plausible narratives. What if technology and policy evolved this way? What if it evolved that way? And they really should not be viewed as one is more likely than the other.
Okay, thank you. So I guess this one is for Michael, and this is possibly in relation to the experience. Should players in the financial sector, such as actuaries, be actively helping to drive the policy changes or just reflect it in our work?
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate through an actuarial committee, whether it's through the CAA. And then, you know, as I mentioned, I'm part of the climate change committee at the CIA. So we do consider policy statements and things like that. So yeah, I definitely think there is a benefit for actuaries to be at the table for those kinds of discussions. It will help sort of promote our profession, and also yeah, I think that that's definitely appropriate through the associations.
I agree. So, and we know that Canada's economy is somewhat different from our Caribbean economies. Canada is reliant on oil and brown assets, which are throwing off cash flows. How would you treat Canadian government bonds in these stress scenarios? And I have a follow-up to that.
So maybe Craig, you'll have some comments as well, but I'll just mention that in the 2019 PRA exercise that we used for our stress test, there was a shock for government bonds, and it was based on a published vulnerability index, and each country sort of was listed in order of how vulnerable they are to climate change. So I can't recall exactly where Canada fits in, but it would consider those comments about reliant on brown assets. Craig, do you have anything to add? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Michael. And I'll just unfortunately flag that we didn't consider sovereign bonds, federal government bonds in the analysis. So unfortunately, I can't really speak to a view in terms of how those would be impacted right now.
Okay, so a follow-up to that. I have one, and this one is for you, Craig. Have you assessed the level of systemic risk given linkages in the economy? And for our Caribbean context, how would you go about doing this, given that our economies have high GDP contributions from services, for example, in the financial and tourism sectors?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we're rolling out a systemic risk project right now, actually, at the bank. So it's funny you ask. We look at this as a multi-phased approach. There's so much to tackling these questions in terms of the resources, the expertise, the data gaps as well. So we really started by focusing on crafting and developing scenarios so that we can ourselves learn a bit more and better understand them, but also disseminate to the financial system and financial institutions. Step 2 now is broadening that scope to look at physical risks, but also broadening that transition exercise to now also consider other financial institutions and potential systemic risks that might arise from the transition. So we're still in that journey right now. What I can say is that the large institutions appear to be very resilient even to some of the most significant shocks that we can hit it with focusing purely on transition risks. In terms of how you folks might consider that, I think viewing it as an iterative approach is a good way to go. So building that scenario analysis knowledge and capacity is kind of a first step, and moving towards that systemic risk approach, because there inevitably will be data gaps that you'll have to you have to bridge. I think Michael touched on one that really resonated with me is this probability of default of fixed income. How do you measure that? How do you calibrate that? Oftentimes this is a very difficult and resource intensive thing to do. We proposed a methodology and applied it, leveraging some of our financial institutions' expertise, but it was very resource intensive as one of the outcomes we determined from that exercise.
I'm sorry, I got bumped off, so I didn't catch that last part, but I'm sure it's recorded. So thank you for that response. So I'm going to go to the next question. So was stress in the stress testing, did stress testing inform or change which counterparties, sectors warranted heightened attention and focus?
I assume that's a question for me. You know, we did it to see what the impact would be on solvency. It wasn't really done by my team to look at strategic portfolio management or that sort of thing. So I'd say that, yeah, the work that I did was not for that purpose.
Okay. So as a follow-up, do you foresee that the way in which you model these risks, do you see it encapturing broader risks such as physical risks? So for example, in a tourism-dependent economy like Jamaica, physical risk is very important because if there's no beach, there's no real product. Yeah. How do you think about future iterations of your risk analysis to incorporate different types of risk?
Yeah, incorporating physical risk is definitely high on my goals, something I'd like to do more of. It's just not, transition risk for a large company that is diversified globally is more of a concern these days. The physical risk aspect we deem not a solvency risk for Manulife, but I think if you ask colleagues in a P&C world, or like you said, someone in a country that has higher exposure to physical risk, they may have some more insight to that, but that's not something that I've really taken a deep dive into as of yet.
Okay.
Perhaps I can jump in a little bit as we're embarking on a physical risk scenario exercise in Canada. We're focusing our efforts on exposures and hazards that are arguably the most relevant to Canada right now. So it might differ a little bit from the Caribbean's perspective, but in terms of flood risk, not just sea level rise, but inland flooding as well, on residential mortgages. That's been identified as a key potential vulnerability of climate change. So we're looking at these long-term projections where we look at the existing stock of residential mortgages and then trying to assess how vulnerable those are to changes in flood risk associated with climate change moving forward. So I can imagine, for example, sea level rise, looking at critical infrastructure and how it's tied to the financial system could be a very relevant physical risk, acute physical risk to look at.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just wrap things up with this final question. I think, Craig, you're probably the best one to answer this. I know we're not fortune tellers, right? But what impact would the increased instability due to the pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine war have on these scenarios that you've used? Would these shocks require revisions to the economic scenarios?
So, I mean, any major event like that, these scenarios, let me just back up. These scenarios, ours at the Bank of Canada, the NGFS, the Bank of England, IPCC, they're going to continue to have to be revised as technology, our understanding of technologies, innovations and inventions continue to roll out. We're going to have to change our assumptions in those scenarios. As policy develops, we'll have to change the assumptions. As significant geopolitical events take place, surely that can have an effect on how the world economy works. It's actually a very interesting question. I think we're still, unfortunately, at an early stage in fully understanding what these impacts are, but there has been some interesting work come out of leveraging these GTAP type models out of Purdue University, for example, that have started to look at some of these questions, and we're keeping a pretty close eye on it. But I think the general answer there is that these scenarios will always have to be revisited as we move forward.
Okay. Great, thank you. And so thank you, Craig and Michael. Really insightful stuff. And I hope that, everyone who asked the question had, a good answer to them. So what I'm gonna do is to actually do a poll. So once I get an idea of what type of considerations are being made with respect to climate change in the audience's work. So I'm gonna launch a poll now. Pedro, could you do that, please? All right, thank you for that, Pedro. So it seems most of the audience is discussing climate change impact in their work. It seems we have a little work to do in this non-natal segment, because I'm sure climate change does impact our work in some way or another. All right, thank you. All right, well, with that, I'm gonna actually conclude the session. I would like to give a special thanks to our presenters, Craig and Michael, for participating in our first climate change committee lunch and learn webinar. We know that you're very busy, and so we appreciate you sharing your work and being so generous with your time. Also, a big thank you to the members of the climate change committee, as well as the CAA technical team, including Pedro, who worked very diligently behind the scenes just to ensure that today's session was possible and ran smoothly. And thank you finally to all the attendees for spending your time with us. We know that it was titled Lunch and Learn and there was no lunch, but we hope that you learned something and that today's session was valuable. So just a final housekeeping. Please note that a recording of today's session, it will be posted on the CA's YouTube page. So if you'd like to view it again or share with a friend, please visit that page. And with that, I would like to thank you and say a very good goodbye.